Welcome, everybody. I'm Eric Van Ryn, and I'm the director of the University of California Press. Welcome to today's session, Understanding the Impact of Print Revenues when University Press Books are Open Access. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues, Laura Brown, Senior Advisor at Ithaca Strategy and Research, John Shearer, the Spangler Family Director of the University of North Carolina Press, and Miranda Bennett, Director of Shared Collections at the California Digital Library of the University of California. Today, we'll discuss a study that was generously funded by the National Endowment for Humanities that sought to answer the question, what happens to sales of print books when their corresponding electronic editions are made available on an open access basis? The study was conducted under the auspices of the Association of University Presses, and we thank them for sponsoring the study. And we had collaboration from Ithaca Strategy and Research in the authoring of the report and the analysis of the data. Our question was prompted by a survey that was conducted by the Association of University Presses Open Access Committee that indicated that over 60% of 101 reporting presses had engaged in some form of open access monograph publishing. This study allowed us to gather hard data on the effect that open access publishing has on print sales, which university presses continue to use as an important cost recovery mechanism when publishing OA titles. But how much can print sales actually contribute? This is a key question that our study sought to answer, and we'll share some of the data that we uncovered during this presentation. Before turning it over to Laura, I would like to thank a couple of additional folks who were involved in the study. First of all, Roger Schoenfeld and Maya Dayan of Ithaca S&R contributed significantly to this project in its research and development phase and are also our co-authors on the study. Also, Brenna McLaughlin of the AU Press's central office was instrumental in the project. Without Brenna's help, we would never have been able to gather the volume of data that we gathered. And Brenna is also a co-author on the study. I'll initially turn it over to Laura Brown, who will share some analysis of our findings. Then John Shearer will provide some publisher perspective on how publishers view these findings. And Miranda Bennett will speak about how these findings might impact conversations about how libraries fund open access monograph initiatives. We'll present for approximately 30 minutes and try to leave about 10 minutes for a moderated Q&A at the end. Laura, take it away.
Okay, thanks so much, Eric. Maybe we can just go straight on to the first slide. This is a thanks to the National Endowment for funding this study. And if you look at the next slide, okay, so here we are. This is the agenda we have today. As Eric said, I'm going to go through the findings, but then we're going to have perspectives, and then we're going to turn it over to you all for questions or some of your suggestions. So let's go straight to the findings part now. Eric, next slide. So this is our data set. We had 26 publishers, all AUP participants, members. You know, that was not as many as we hoped for, but this is a really rigorous set of questions we asked. So what we came up with is still a substantial data set. We had over almost 1,000 titles, all of them with different flavors of open access, and all of them with basically born digital open access. And we think this was a great core for our analysis, but also we think it's going to be a great base for future inquiries into this whole area. So that sort of, you know, laying down that groundwork for how we track this over the future is going to be, I think, really helpful. So let's go on to the actual findings. So the first finding here is that OA titles can generate significant print revenue. We found that of all the titles, the mean sales were $15,000, and the median sales were almost $6,000. You know, I think we went into this thinking, well, maybe there's not going to be any sales at all. I remember John Shearer saying, you know, that's kind of the assumption about it, but that's actually not true. There's a meaningful contribution of print sales to the sustainability of open access. And I think that's one of the huge finds. We're going to talk about these sort of outliers, these titles that sold a whole lot, which kind of skewed the results. But you can still see that even without those, we have a meaningful contribution of between $5,000 and $8,000. So the next slide. We took a look at this on behalf of the presses for the size of the press to see what kind of difference that made. We were not surprised, basically, that the smallest presses were had the lowest sales, and the largest presses had the greatest sales. So that, we're not exactly sure why that is. Could be marketing, could be all kinds of things, could be the books themselves. But what was surprising was that size was not the only determinant, because if you look at this tier 2 and tier 3, and these are AUP tiers, that tier 2, the median size, was very close in some ways to the large presses, whereas the large presses were very close to the very small. So size is not the only determinant, we would say, of this. There are a lot of others, and we're going to look at those. So, so title distribution, you see that this basically follows a bell curve. Most of the titles had sales between $5,000 and $10,000, but also some had very large sales. So $10,000 contribution for 30% or greater, 10,000 or greater for 30% of the titles. And for 8% of the titles, they had over $20,000, which is still that's a really great return for probably any monograph, let alone an open access monograph. So that was sort of the way that the pattern fell out. If you go to the next slide, Eric, we also found that there was meaningful digital revenue. Now, we didn't expect to find this, I think, at all. And what we're talking about when we talk about digital revenue is basically consumer digital. We asked the presses not to include library digital revenues. We didn't think there'd be much anyway, because a lot of these titles, if they're open access, are excluded from library distributor providers. But we found is that they added basically $1,700 to the mean of sales, which is not insignificant, $600 to the median. And for some titles, if we go to the next slide, you'll see that there was, while most titles did not have anything or had minimal sales, some had substantial sales. So 18% had $2,000 or greater in digital sales. And we think this is a finding that's worth thinking about for presses, because there probably isn't much of a strategy of what to do about these digital versions. But there's obviously some calculation about what should happen in that space. And it could be that some of these platforms are adding value, that people know there's an open access version, but still think, I want it on my Kindle, or I want it whatever. So that seems like something that would be worth thinking about in terms of the consumer side. Now, format, you can see here that close to half of all the titles published were published only in paperback, with some only in hardcover, many fewer, and some published as both hardcover and paperback. But if we go now to what happens in that publishing decision, you can see that the titles that were only paperback generated about $6,000 in the mean, and about $5,000 in the median. But if you publish both a hardcover and a paperback, you generated the most income, and that was between $13,000 for the mean and $10,000 for the median. So we think it's really worth thinking about. That's double if you only publish paperback. So we think for publishers, it's probably worth really thinking about that kind of formatting strategy and whether it's worth actually adding a hardcover to whatever that decision is. So now if we think a little bit about the field, you can see here that the STEM titles were by far the best revenue generators. And even if we remove computer science, which is a huge contributor to that, they're still at the very top here, with social sciences not too far behind, certainly in the median sales, and humanities and history at the lower end of things, with a $6,000 to $8,000 range. So there definitely is a decision here about which fields you're publishing in, and we think publishers should think about this. There are also some learnings here around the pricing, and this is worth actually digging into a little bit more. If you're a publisher, you can get into our open data set and you can start to look at this from your own point of view about what's going on. So that's basically sales by field. We also, you'll see in some of the earlier slides that we looked at these outliers. We had 13 titles that produced over $100,000 in print sales. And most of them, I think all but one of them, was from the Group 4 presses, which is probably expected. And so, but most of them had another market besides a core academic market, and that's what we call these sort of crossover potential professional or textbook sales, supplementary sales in the college market. And there was also an issue here with how discoverable they were. So some of them were not in this kind of robust ecosystem of discovery that's kind of ideal for an open access title to drive the most usage. Some of them were only available on author websites. And that's something that, we should take into account when we're looking at these outliers. But we will say that there's the potential here for some parts of a list always to break out. And that's true for non-open access, but it also turns out to be true for open access, that a title, because it's open access, does not necessarily mean it can't have really strong sales and it can't help to drive the overall sales of a list. So that's also something to think about. So if we go to the next slide, we did collect some information about what kind of sustainability models people were using, where the revenues were coming from. And you can see here that there's really a mix of strategies: libraries, publisher-specific programs, grant programs, institutional programs. But what we'd like to draw the attention to here is that print sales have a place in this. Obviously, from this study, we can see that. And perhaps if more attention is paid to the way we publish these OA titles, the print editions, that there could be even more contribution. So that's really something for publishers to think very hard about. And we would say that the biggest takeaway here is maybe we need to revisit the models that we're using. It's not all about libraries or all about grant funding or all about institutional funding. It's some really complex mix that might be able to lead to sustainability for OA in the future. And that's something that might be worth really looking at. So if we go to the next stage, that's just one of the things we've talked about. We think there are a lot of opportunities here for further research, whether we really don't have a good comparator with the open access and the non-open access monographs. That's something we think is worth really trying to get some data on. We think it would be wonderful to correlate what these print sales are with what the usage is driven by open access. After all, that's the whole point of having open access, is to drive more usage. So, so there are a lot of different questions here on the future research side of things. And we're really hoping to hear from you all about where you think some of the future research could go. So that would be one piece. And finally, we have a bunch of questions beyond future research. So if we look at those, these are just a few of them that we've heard from other audiences we've presented this material to. One is like, how robust is this metadata? and can we improve it for discovery of these open access titles, and the print versions of them connected to them. And that's part of this kind of seamless discovery experience that we think is a possibility to try and build a better sort of mousetrap there. And we've also heard, questions about the ethical considerations of charging, especially for the consumer books when they're open access in the market. So there are some of those things. We think there are lots more questions. And so I think we'll leave the findings here and turn it over to John to talk a little bit about how a publisher sees them. So John, over to you.
Thank you, Laura. I've seen you present this a number of times, and every time I learn something new, and just it's such a remarkable study. I'm really pleased to have been a part of it. My own goals for this study were, pick it up on some of the things that Laura was talking about. There was this myth that OA is just going to completely cannibalize print sales, and so I just thought we needed some data to go against that. But we've been looking at trying to do more OA here at UNC Press, but we didn't have a sense for what was the reasonable expense to charge for that. Like, what was the justification for an incremental stipend to support OA? And so this has been helping us to think about that. Laura's right that our study didn't go into comparable paywalled titles to try and find the delta. That's really kind of left up to the press. And so I'm just going to take a minute to do the work that we've been doing here at One Press to do exactly that. So we've been mapping our own averages at UNC against this aggregated data. And I'm fortunate that our sales are a little bit higher. So in the data set, the group 3 press range was 4,400 to 5,300. But for UNC, and we don't have a ton of open access books, but double digits. And so for us, the sales are more like $12,500 for books that are more than 2 years old. And it's worth noting that a lot of the books in this study are quite young. And there's this interesting, one of the things for future study is like what happens to print when OA ages, and presumably there's higher discoverability and maybe yielding more print sales in the long tail. But for us, it's about 12,500. And so, and the least sales for us was 8,200. So, we're really encouraged by those numbers. And we have done a lot of analysis of our average income for paywalled specialized monographs, and that's more like 15,000. So we're talking about a 10, 20% kind of decline when books are OA. We've also chosen not to sell Kindle or any digital editions for a fee. So given those averages that Laura was showing, if we had charged for Kindle, we might have been kind of flat. But don't get me wrong, we should get stipends as publishers or some kind of additional support for publishing OA. Monograph publishing is incredibly risky, and everyone who benefits from a potential OA system should support that initial risk, not just the presses. So I think most importantly, it's actually the author host institution who by far gets the most value out of what we do. So they should be in the game. I think libraries should be in the game because we really help build collections and readers and usage, but as well as the institutions that have chosen to create the presses to do this risky work. Presses probably need more help to do more open access work. So the thing I think that's missing here is digital usage data. And that was, again, outside the scope of our study. But for me, it's what's coming next. If I can do more OA with just a bit more upfront funding, and I can show engagement numbers in the tens of thousands instead of killing ourselves to sell a few hundred copies, then I think those potential other financial sources, the author host institution, libraries, institutions hosting presses, I think those sources might be compelled to support the advancement of the humanities that is uniquely done by university presses who publish monographs and show this type of impact. So I think I'll just leave it there as One Press's story, and then I turn it over to Miranda.
Thank you so much, John, and thanks for the opportunity to offer some thoughts about this really fascinating study about OA monographs and print revenue. I'm Miranda Bennett. I'm Director of Shared Collections at California Digital Library, which is part of the 10-campus University of California system, along with the UC Press. So Eric is a colleague of mine. So I'm going to share with you a few thoughts from a librarian's perspective on the key findings that Laura reviewed. And I do want to emphasize this is a librarian's perspective, certainly not the librarian's perspective, just as John spoke about a publisher and not all. So I want to talk a little bit about potential library markets for print versions of open access monographs, and then share a few questions that I've been reflecting on about the potential for that individual consumer or end reader market. So within the library community, I think there may be interest in purchasing or acquiring print copies of open access monographs for a few reasons. One might be an interest in preservation, so the redundancy and security that comes from having a print version as well as the electronic version, particularly if that print version can be held in environmentally stable, carefully controlled conditions. There's also a strong interest in the library community in preserving the stability of content. I'm not at all saying that we suspect our university library colleagues are changing content of open access monographs in the dead of night or anything like that. But we do know that sometimes, for example, a new edition might come and supersede an earlier edition, and libraries feel a strong obligation to preserve the entirety of the scholarly record, want to make sure any of those changes are carefully documented, and print can really support that. There's also an interest in providing print copies to library patrons. We know many people prefer print, especially for long form reading. So having a way to make that available to those we serve could be very appealing. And with any of these examples, kind of bundling print copies as part of support for an OA program could be appealing to libraries, understanding that there are many libraries that have serious space crunches, and the acquisition of any additional print needs to be really carefully considered. There also could be some more specific library markets. For example, an institutional library might want to acquire print copies of books written by its own authors. That would be obviously by definition a small market, but perhaps of interest. Libraries may want to collect the print in subject areas that are areas of strength in their collections. And libraries that are participating in shared print programs might be a potential market, because I do think that while shared print, for the most part now, is a retrospective endeavor, not prospective, there are relationships and infrastructure in place there that could support collective and collaborative acquisition of these print copies. And I do think that across the board, this would be something that libraries might want to do in concert with one another rather than as individual institutions. So I do also want to take the liberty of talking a little bit about the individual consumer market, because I do think that in some cases, those are the same people who are our library patrons. And if not, I think they do share a number of characteristics. So I really appreciated Laura highlighting some of the findings in the study about this market and some of the questions that it raises. So one thing that Laura mentioned that I would reiterate is, what is the price range that might appeal to a reader interested in acquiring the print? And what's the price range that also would be sustainable for publishers? What might be the features of the value-added features of an ebook where the open access version is already freely available? Compatibility with e-readers might be one of those that was mentioned by John, perhaps some note-taking features. Who knows, right? Probably the same content, but perhaps with some additional functionality. And then also thinking about the particular market for scholarly monographs, it seems possible to me that the people interested in this content would like to know, if they were to purchase one of these other versions, another format of an open access monograph, that could be an enhanced ebook, it could be a print copy. For some of these, perhaps there's even a market for an audiobook. They might like to know that their purchase is supporting open access publishing. So perhaps it's something not to hide, but actually to foreground and share with readers as they're considering making these purchases. So thanks again for the opportunity to reflect on this really interesting study, and I'm really looking forward to talking with my fellow panelists and those of you attending the virtual Charleston conference. I'll turn it back over to Eric now for some quick closing remarks.
Thank you all for your presentations. It's been wonderful to have all of your perspectives on the data. I'm not going to provide too much in the area of conclusions, but rather I'm just going to open it up to the audience to engage in some Q&A and discussion at this point. So we'll open it up for the chat, and thanks everybody for attending.